One day, you are talking to someone. Maybe it is a friend you have known for years. Maybe it is someone you were falling for. Maybe it is a person you trusted with the quiet, unguarded parts of yourself. The parts you do not show just anyone. And then, without warning, without a fight, without even a goodbye, they are gone. No explanation, and no closure, no final message. That at least gives you something to hold on to. Just silence. And somehow, that silence is louder than anything they ever said to you. You check your phone. You reread the last conversation, searching for clues like a detective at a crime scene. You replay moments in your head, wondering if you missed something, said something wrong, were too much or not enough. You build entire courtrooms in your mind, and then you play both the prosecutor and the defense, over and over, until you are exhausted from a trial that never had a verdict. This is what ghosting does to a person. But here is the thing that nobody tells you, and this is the part that is going to shift something inside you today. The person who disappeared was not cruel. They were afraid. And the fear that made them vanish? You have felt that exact same fear before. Maybe you just handled it differently. Welcome to the architecture of ghosting. Not the surface-level conversation about bad manners or modern dating culture. Not the listicle version with 5 easy tips to get over it. This is the deep excavation. The psychological post-mortem. The philosophical mirror that asks you to look not just at the person who left, but at the part of yourself that already understands why they did. Because ghosting is not a new behavior. It does not belong to a generation or a dating app or a cultural decline in empathy. It is ancient. It is survival. It is the oldest emotional exit strategy that human beings have ever invented. And once you truly understand what it is built from, nothing about it will ever feel the same again. Let us start at the very beginning. Not the beginning of the relationship, but the beginning of the person. Think about a child, small, dependent, completely at the mercy of the emotional climate around them. That child does not have the vocabulary to say, "I feel overwhelmed by this relationship and I need space to process my emotional needs." That child does not have the neurological development to sit across from a parent or a sibling or a peer and navigate conflict with grace and self-awareness. What that child has is instinct. And when instinct meets emotional pain, it does one of 3 things. It fights. It freezes. Or it runs. The child who eventually becomes a ghoster, they learn to run. But here is what matters. Here is the thing that separates a psychological deep dive from a simple explanation. They did not run because they were bad. They ran because, at some critical point in their formation, running worked. Maybe they grew up in a household where expressing emotion was dangerous. Where saying "I am hurt" was met with dismissal, or anger, or a silence so cold, it taught them that vulnerability was a liability. So they learned to disappear inside themselves first emotionally, psychologically, before eventually learning to disappear from the outside world too. Maybe they had a parent who was emotionally unpredictable. One day warm, the next day withdrawn. And as a child, navigating that landscape, they developed a hypervigilance, a constant reading of the room, a constant monitoring of emotional temperature, and when that temperature dropped, their trained response was not to engage. It was to evacuate. Maybe they experienced a rupture, a friendship that ended badly, a love that left them shattered, a betrayal so deep it rewrote the code of how they relate to closeness. And the lesson they carried forward was brutal in its simplicity. Connection ends in pain. Disappearing first ends in safety. This is what psychology calls an avoidant attachment style. But that label, while useful, does not capture the texture of it. The lived, daily, exhausting reality of being a person whose nervous system has learned to treat intimacy as a threat. Imagine carrying a shield everywhere you go. Not because you are aggressive. Not because you want to hurt anyone. But because the last time you put the shield down, someone hit you in the chest so hard you could not breathe for what felt like years. You carry the shield, you function, you even connect up to a point. And then the moment someone gets close enough to see past the shield, close enough to touch the soft and undefended place beneath it, something ancient and automatic kicks in. And you run, not with a letter, not with a conversation, not even with a text, Because a text would require you to stand still long enough to feel what you were running from. And feeling it, really feeling it, is the thing your entire internal architecture was built to prevent. This is the emotional engineering of a ghoster. This is not a character flaw. This is a survival blueprint that was drawn in childhood and has been running silently in the background ever since. Now, let us go deeper, because avoidant attachment explains the mechanism, but it does not explain the full psychology of what happens in the moment someone chooses to ghost. There is a concept in Jungian psychology called the shadow. Jung described it as the part of the self that we refuse to look at, the part we exile into darkness because it feels too threatening, too shameful, too incompatible with the version of ourselves we want to believe in. Most people who ghost do not think of themselves as people who ghost. This is the crucial, often overlooked piece. If you could sit down with the average person who has disappeared on someone they cared about and say, "Tell me about the time you ghosted," they would flinch. Many would not even use that word. They would say, "I just needed space," or "would not handle it," or "it was going to hurt them more if I said it out loud." Because the shadow does not announce itself. It operates below the level of conscious decision-making. What feels like a choice, the choice to not respond, to let the silence stretch, to eventually stop picking up the phone, is very rarely experienced as a deliberate act of cruelty. It is experienced as a kind of emotional paralysis, a freezing, a sense that any movement, any response, any engagement would somehow make things worse. The ghoster is not sitting in a room, laughing at your confusion. Far more often, they are sitting in their own room, unable to look at their phone either, because looking at it means confronting the fact that they are doing something that, on some level, they know is causing pain. And the capacity to sit with that knowledge, to hold the discomfort of having hurt someone, requires an emotional maturity that their internal architecture simply was not built to support. They are not withholding because they are powerful. They are hiding because they are overwhelmed. This is the inversion that changes everything. Think about the last time you were in a situation you did not know how to handle. Not a practical problem, an emotional one. A conversation you did not know how to start. A truth you did not know how to deliver. A relationship you did not know how to exit without causing damage. What did you feel in your body? For most people, it is a tightening, a kind of psychological gridlock, where every option feels like it leads to something worse, and the paralysis of not choosing feels, in that moment, like the only tolerable option. Now amplify that feeling by 10. Add a nervous system that was trained from childhood to treat emotional confrontation as dangerous. Add a shadow that tells you that your honest feelings, your real reasons, are too ugly, too selfish, or too hurtful to say out loud. Add the belief, worn smooth by years of reinforcement, that you are better at disappearing than you are at staying. This is the inner landscape of a ghoster at the moment they choose silence. And it is not power. It is not control. It is not indifference. It is a person who is so afraid of the confrontation that they have turned their own disappearance into a mercy for themselves, and in the distorted logic of their avoidance, for you too. Let us talk about the concept of emotional architecture, because this is the framework that makes everything else make sense. Every person builds an internal structure for managing closeness and distance. This structure is not chosen consciously. It is constructed over years, layer by layer, of the raw materials of experience. The relationships that worked, the ones that failed, the moments of connection that felt safe, and the moments of vulnerability that felt catastrophic. For some people, that architecture is open, permeable, built with wide doors and transparent walls. These are the people who can sit across from someone they care about and say, "I need to end this, and here is why, and I want to do it with as much care as possible." Their emotional architecture supports that kind of honesty because, at some point in their history, honesty was rewarded rather than punished. For others, the architecture is closed, defended, built with thick walls and no windows, and a single, narrow exit, and that exit leads not to the front door of honest conversation, but to the back door of disappearance. These people did not choose to build it this way. They built it in the dark, with whatever materials were available, in response to an environment that required them to protect themselves in ways that now, as adults, look like emotional unavailability. The tragedy, and it is a genuine tragedy, is that the very architecture that protected them as children becomes the structure that traps them as adults. Because the person who built walls to survive the emotional chaos of childhood carries those walls into every adult relationship. And when intimacy begins to grow, when someone gets close enough that the walls would have to come down, the alarm systems built into that architecture begin to fire. Not because the closeness is actually dangerous, but because it feels like it is. The body does not know the difference between a threat from the past and safety in the present. It only knows the feeling, and the feeling says, run. There is a philosopher named Blaise Pascal who wrote that all of humanity's problems stem from the inability to sit quietly in a room alone. He was talking about distraction, about the human tendency to flee from stillness. But his observation cuts even deeper into the psychology of ghosting than he perhaps intended. Because ghosting, at its most fundamental level, is the inability to sit quietly in the discomfort of a difficult conversation. It is the flight from stillness, from the terrifying, necessary stillness of saying, "This is not working for me, and I need to tell you that, even though it will be painful, even though I do not have perfect words, even though you might cry, or get angry, or ask me questions I cannot fully answer." The ghoster cannot sit in that room, not because they are a bad person, but because nobody ever taught them that they could. Nobody modeled for them what it looks like to navigate the end of a connection with grace. Nobody showed them that conflict, handled with care, does not have to be catastrophic. Nobody sat with them in their childhood discomfort long enough for them to learn that feelings, even terrible, crushing, messy feelings, can be survived. So instead, they learned the only lesson that was available to them in the absence of that modeling: avoid the room entirely. And they have been avoiding rooms ever since. This is not an excuse. The pain of being ghosted is real, and it deserves to be named and honored without minimization. But understanding the mechanism does not mean condoning the behavior. It means seeing it clearly, which is the only vantage point from which any real healing becomes possible. Now let us turn the mirror around. Because this conversation is not just about the people who have ghosted you. It is also about the times, and there have been times, for almost everyone, when you were the one who went quiet. Think about the message you never sent back, the phone call you let go to voicemail and then somehow never return, the friendship that drifted, not because either of you decided to end it, but because you both chose the path of least resistance and let the silence do the work. This is what might be called micro-ghosting. The small-scale disappearances that most people never count because they do not happen in the context of romance, because they feel too minor, because the narrative of ghosting in popular culture is about the dramatic vanishing, not the quiet drift. But the psychology is identical: the avoidance of a difficult conversation, the preference for ambiguity over clarity, the unconscious calculation that silence, while unkind, is somehow less destructive than words. And if you sit with that, honestly, if you really let yourself look at the moments when you chose the back door instead of the front, you will find something interesting. You will find that in those moments, you were not thinking about the other person at all. You were thinking about yourself, about how uncomfortable the conversation would be, about what they might say that you would not know how to respond to, about the version of yourself that might emerge from that conversation, vulnerable, uncertain, possibly wrong, and how unbearable it felt to inhabit that version, even temporarily. This is not a condemnation. This is a recognition. We ghost to protect ourselves, and we dress that protection up in language that makes it sound like consideration. I did not want to hurt them. It was better this way. They are better off without the explanation, because acknowledging the truth, which is that we ran from our own discomfort, is too uncomfortable to hold. This is the shadow, doing what shadows do, operating in the dark, wearing a mask that looks like mercy. Let us bring in one more framework, because this one illuminates something that almost nobody talks about when it comes to ghosting. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote about the concept of ressentiment, a French word he used to describe a particular kind of emotional posture, the feeling of powerlessness that transforms into a passive form of revenge. The resentment that, because it cannot express itself directly, expresses itself sideways. Not all ghosting is resentment, but some of it is. There are people who ghost not only because they are afraid, but because, on some level, they want the other person to feel the confusion and helplessness that they themselves once felt in a different context. Perhaps in a different relationship. Perhaps in childhood. Perhaps in a dynamic they have never fully processed. This is the darker territory, the part that is harder to speak about without sounding accusatory. But radical understanding requires going here, because pretending it does not exist is just another form of avoidance. When a person ghosts someone who genuinely cared about them, and there is a flicker, even an unconscious flicker of satisfaction in the other person's attempts to reach out, in the power of being the one who holds the silence that is resentment in action, it is the powerless child who was never heard, finally finding a way to make someone else feel invisible. It is not malicious in a calculated sense. It is not even conscious, most of the time, but it is real. And it is one of the reasons that some ghosting carries a particular quality of cruelty, because the person intended to be cruel, but because the wound that produced their behavior was one that only understood cruelty as a form of expression. Pain that has never been witnessed has a way of finding an exit, and sometimes that exit is you. This is one of the most important things to understand if you are someone who has been ghosted in a way that felt genuinely targeted, genuinely cold, genuinely like more than just avoidance. It probably was more than just avoidance, but the source of it was not your unworthiness. The source of it was someone else's unhealed wound, finding you as its exit point. You were not the cause, you were the location. Now, let's talk about what happens to the person who is ghosted. Because the architecture of this experience is just as complex and just as important. When someone you care about disappears without explanation, your brain does something very specific. It does not grieve. It cannot grieve, because grief requires a clear loss, a defined end, a moment you can point to and say, this is where it stopped. Ghosting does not give you that moment. Instead, your brain enters a state of ambiguity processing. It keeps the relationship open in cognitive terms, because there has been no signal to close it. It continues to run the emotional programs associated with that person, checking for them, thinking about them, feeling the pull of them, because the neural pathways built around that connection have not received the signal to deactivate. This is why being ghosted often hurts more than a clean breakup. It is not because the relationship was necessarily deeper. It is because the brain cannot complete its processing without information. The absence of closure is not just emotionally painful, it is neurologically disorienting. The brain is left in a loop, running and rerunning the same searches, looking for data that never arrives. Psychologists sometimes compare this to a phenomenon called intermittent reinforcement, the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. When rewards are unpredictable, when connection comes and goes without a clear pattern, the brain becomes hyperactivated around the search for that connection. It becomes more attached, not less. The uncertainty does not create distance, it creates obsession. Ghosting does not just remove a person from your life. It leaves a ghost in your mind, and that ghost is your own unanswered questions, haunting you in the absence of information. And here is where it gets even more psychologically precise. The questions you ask yourself in the wake of being ghosted are almost never really about the other person. They feel like they are about the other person. What did I do wrong? What was it about me? Why was I not worth a response? But they are not. They are questions your early self already had. Questions you brought with you into this relationship, from every wound that came before it. Questions about your worthiness, your lovability, your capacity to be chosen and kept. The ghosting did not create those questions, it just activated them. It pulled them up from wherever they had been stored, quiet, waiting, and threw them at you all at once, in the context of a fresh pain, where they felt more real and more urgent than ever. This is why being ghosted can feel disproportionately devastating, not always because of who left, but because of what they're leaving touched inside you. The old wound under the new one. The childhood question hiding inside the adult heartbreak. Let us step back and look at the broader cultural container in which ghosting happens, because that container matters more than we usually acknowledge. We live in an era of infinite optionality. The psychological impact of this is something that researchers are only beginning to fully understand. But the basic principle is not complicated. When any individual connection is one among dozens, hundreds, even thousands of potential connections, when there is always another person just a swipe away, always another conversation waiting to be started, always another version of intimacy that might be easier, less complicated, less demanding than the one you are currently navigating, the perceived cost of any single relationship changes. The calculus of commitment shifts. It is not that people become less capable of depth. It is that the environment makes depth feel optional in a way it never did before. When connection was scarce geographically, socially, culturally, people invested differently. They repaired things because the alternative was a loneliness with no obvious remedy. Now, the alternative is always right there, glowing in your pocket. And this does not make people evil, but it does change the architecture of risk. It makes the difficult conversation feel less necessary, because the difficult conversation is a risk, the risk of rejection, of conflict, of being seen as the problem, and risk feels less worth taking when you believe the alternative is abundant. Ghosting is also, then, a product of a culture that has built infinite exits into every room. And when exits are abundant, the temptation to use them rather than sitting with the discomfort of staying becomes almost gravitational. This does not excuse the behavior, but it contextualizes it in a way that removes some of the personal sting. Because when you understand that the culture itself has designed conditions that make emotional evasion easier than ever before, you can begin to separate the experience of being ghosted from the story that it means something about your particular value to that particular person. Sometimes it does, but often, more often than the pain makes it feel, it means something about the culture both of you were navigating, about the architecture of a world that built 1,000 back doors and forgot to build any guides for how to use the front one. There is a concept in philosophy called moral cowardice, and it is worth naming directly here, without the softening that comes from too much therapeutic framing. Ghosting, in many instances, is moral cowardice, not in the sense of deep ethical violation, but in the sense of choosing the comfortable wrong over the uncomfortable right. The comfortable wrong is silence. It requires nothing. It costs nothing in the immediate moment. It feels, in the body, like relief. The uncomfortable right is honesty. It requires showing up. It costs something real, time, vulnerability, the risk of a reaction you cannot control. It feels, in the body, like walking into a room you would rather avoid. Most people, when given the choice between those two options, and no external accountability, will choose the comfortable wrong. Not because they are bad, because they are human. And humans are wired, at a very fundamental level, to avoid pain, including the pain of causing pain. But here is the philosophical anchor that matters. The philosopher Immanuel Kant gave us a thought experiment called the categorical imperative. It asks, essentially, what if everyone did this? What kind of world would that make? So what do you do with all of this? What do you do when you are sitting with the particular pain of having been ghosted, or with the particular guilt of knowing you have ghosted someone else, or with the more complex territory of recognizing yourself in both sides of this story at once? You do not fix it, not immediately, not with the list of steps or a breathing exercise, or a decision made in the abstract. You look at it, that is all. That is the beginning. You look at the architecture, the one inside you, and the one inside them, and you resist the urge to collapse it into something simpler than it is. You resist the urge to make the person who left you into a villain, because the villain's story feels satisfying, but it does not set you free. And you resist the urge to make yourself into a victim, because the victim's story is even more seductive and even more of a cage. Instead, you sit with the complexity. You hold the fact that someone can care about you and still choose silence. You hold the fact that someone can be avoidant and still be a person of genuine worth. You hold the fact that the pain you feel from being left without words is real and valid and does not require an explanation to justify it. And if you are the one who is ghosted, if you are reading this and recognizing yourself in the architecture of the person who runs you, look at that too. Not with shame. Shame will not save you. Shame just adds another wall to the structure you are already living inside. You look at it with curiosity, with the same radical understanding you are extending to others, with the question that every act of genuine self-knowledge begins with: what was I protecting? What did I believe would happen if I had stayed? Because the answer to that question, the real answer, the one underneath the first answer, and the second answer, and the one you give yourself so you can feel okay about it, that answer is the beginning of something different. It is the beginning of choosing the front door. Carl Jung said that what you resist persists, and what you face transforms. The architecture of ghosting, all of it, the avoidance, and the paralysis, and the shadow, and the resentment, and the cultural permission, and the moral cowardice, all of it persists because we, as a culture, keep finding ways to not look at it directly. We blame the apps, we blame the generation, we blame the other person, we blame the timing. We do not sit with the harder truth, which is that ghosting is a mirror. It reflects something about the person who does it. It reflects something about the relationship between intimacy and fear. And it reflects something about the culture we have collectively built, a culture that makes connection easier to initiate and harder to maintain than at any previous point in human history. Looking into a mirror is uncomfortable, especially when the image looking back is not the one you prefer. But it is the only way to see clearly, and seeing clearly, not feeling better, not moving on, not getting closure, but actually seeing the thing for what it is. That is the beginning of everything. You were not left without explanation because you were not worth one. You were left without explanation because the person who left had not yet learned to speak the language of their own fear. And that fear, that particular ancient, architectural fear, it belongs to them. It was built long before you arrived. And it will continue to be built, layer by layer, wall by wall, until the day they choose to look at what they are constructing and ask themselves whether they want to keep living inside it. That day may not come while you are watching. It may not come in time to give you what you needed, and you are allowed to grieve that. You are allowed to feel the injustice of it. You are allowed to wish that they had been different, more capable, more present, more willing to stay. But you cannot wait inside the silence for an answer that was never coming, because the silence was never actually about you. It was always about the architecture. And so the question this leaves you with, the one worth carrying, as a wound, but as a lantern, is this: what rooms are you avoiding? What conversations have you left in silence? Not because you were cruel, but because you were afraid, and fear dressed itself up as consideration, and you let it. Because the architecture you build inside yourself, the one made of avoidance or the one made of courage, that is not only what shapes your relationships with other people, it is what shapes your relationship with yourself. And that relationship is the only one you are guaranteed to have for the rest of your life. The question for you, sitting with this right now: which truth landed the hardest? Was it recognizing the architecture of the person who ghosted you? Was it seeing yourself in the ghoster? Or was it the moment you realized that the silence they left you in was always, at its deepest level, the sound of someone who had not yet learned to sit with their own noise?